For the first time in a long time, we need to start this report with a disclaimer. Do not keep wild animals in your backyard. How this situation managed to go on for so many years before someone died is absolutely astounding. But let's not get ahead of ourselves and start this outrageous tale from the start. Akil Fakhdin was an Iraqi native that lived in the city of Najaf in southern Iraq all of his 50 years on this planet. He didn't have a massive compound stretching several acres, just a large backyard in a regular neighborhood full of families with kids that played football in the street. If anyone looked over his rather low brick wall, they'd have seen that the backyard was filled to the brim with metal cages, every single one of them holding a different species of exotic animal. Sometimes the neighbors would hear birds of paradise that twittered and squawked. Other times there'd be the unmistakable growl from a feline predator, or barks and yips and bays from some unknown beast. The only thing they knew was that whatever was making the noise, it wouldn't be around for more than a few hours before being replaced by another. Akil bought the animals at a young age, trained them, and then sold them off to collectors for a profit. How he managed to do this is a gaping question that no one's been able to answer yet. Iraq does not grant exotic animal ownership to just anyone, and they're notorious for taxing any outside species so heavily that it's not financially feasible for the majority of the population to keep any unusual pets. And that's being done with very good reason. The government feels that if you cannot afford the heavy taxes, then you cannot afford to give any animal the appropriate feed, care, housing, and most importantly, to set up your property in such a way that they cannot get out into the streets. So how Akil was able to afford the taxes and to fly under the radar when it came to his wildly unsafe enclosures is a complete mystery. His walls were too low, only 4 meters high in some places. There were no double lock gates for each animal and no security measures like cameras or electric fences in or around his yard at all. Naturally, most believe it was completely illegal, but he'd been running this operation for decades and all of his neighbors knew about it. So it could be that authorities were aware of Akil's unusual business venture, but that they never bothered to enforce safety regulations. Who knows how he managed to do it for so long, with so many safety precautions completely ignored and no overseeing body to regulate him. If we're being honest here, it's a miracle that this terrible event hadn't happened years ago. Whatever the case, Akil purchased a young African lion sometime in May of 2025. It was old enough that its mane started coming in. By lion standards, that's barely an adult. Judging by the photos, he would have been around 2 years old. Akil gave him a few days to acclimate to his tiny prison, getting him used to the fact that this man always brought food and clean water. Akil had done this a few times before with a dozen lions in the past, as well as tigers and other predatory cats. After the first week, when they stopped frantically pacing their cages and realized that the metallic stick that Akil carried hurt if they got too close, was all he expected of them before he'd lead them out and start training them to tolerate humans, to walk beside them on leashes and to allow them a bit of freedom to stretch their legs around the tiny lawn. 6 days into feeding and talking to his new purchase, Akil decided it was time. He chose the hottest part of the day when lions are most docile and fed the animal just before so that he'd be extra lazy. A neighbor next door who was having tea on his roof watched from above as the new arrival took his first tentative steps outside of his metal bars. The neighbor had seen this procedure happen many times before. Just another day with his strange but kind neighbor and all of his equally strange animals. Akil had the whipping stick in hand, and when the feline stepped out, several things happened at once. 4 falcons in the cage in the far corner screeched in unison. A pair of foxes yipped in another, and 2 zebras bawled in panic. There wasn't even a nervous mule or an uncertain sidestepping from the lion. The reaction was instant. Not only was it out of its claustrophobic prison, the world had only erupted in chaos around it, switching on its fight or flight mode. Naturally, any male lion would choose to fight. The moment all 4 of his feet were outside the gate and Akil was next to him with that damned painful stick, that animal exploded with rage. It turned on its owner with grace and speed that only felines possess. Akil raised the thin metal bar and brought it down on the lion's face, but he might as well have used a fly swatter. It had no effect on the animal at all. It drew its body back and pounced on top of the man who was still trying to beat him back with the flimsy stick. Akil crumpled under 220 pounds of adolescent lion, screaming louder than the zebras in the corner. Its aim was pinpoint accurate, right on the jugular. Akil's scream of terror was cut off instantly. All he could do was to grab onto the lion's sparse mane, feebly attempting to pull it off as the life drained out of him. Up from the roof, the neighbor's teacup shattered on the floor and he sprinted downstairs. The moment the animal pounced, he was on his feet, reacting with nearly as much speed as the lion he just watched grab his friend around the neck. As he headed out the door, he grabbed up a Kalashnikov rifle from his military days and loaded it as his sandaled feet carried him outside. Like an Arabic action hero, he jumped onto an old storage container to look over the fence. He wasn't stupid enough to launch himself over that wall with a raging lion in the yard, but it did put him in the perfect position to keep his firearm pointed at it if it tried to escape, and to yell for his wife to call authorities. By the time he reached the wall, Akil was already silent. His formerly gray dishdasha was now completely scarlet, torn to shreds and indistinguishable from the ruined ribbons that used to be Akil's face and neck. The neighbor knew that his longtime friend was dead. No living man would flop and flail that way while the cat shook him back and forth like a dog's chew toy. It took 20 minutes for police cars to swarm the street, completely in disbelief about the call about a rampaging lion in a residential neighborhood. The rest of the street was already cleared of playing children and pedestrians because the neighbor continued to yell from his perch at the wall, spreading the news as far as he could without moving from his position. In the 20 minutes since the attack happened, the animal had already gulped down most of Akil's thigh, a great part of his abdomen, and it had consumed parts of its captor's buttocks. When police arrived, they unsuccessfully tried to coax the lion away from the body, hoping that they could tranquilize it. The damage was already done after all. But when it started eating at Akil's lower back, they realized that the animal intended to devour the man completely in full view of a wall lined with no less than 30 officers and an ex-military neighbor. The decision was made to open fire. It took 7 rounds before the lion dropped dead. Ironically, it was the neighbor's final round that found the lion's head that administered the kill shot. And to this day, he still believes that if he'd just killed it in the beginning, without waiting for police to arrive, at least Akil's family could have buried him relatively whole. Instead, they got a ruined corpse and a box of mushed bone and flesh that had to be taken out of the lion's digestive tract. The Iraqi government still hasn't commented on why Akil had managed to run this operation for so many years. Clearly, he'd never been subjected to an inspection, nor was there any concern about it happening in a neighborhood where families with children lived. He had to have gotten the animals in from somewhere, and he sold them to people in other countries. If this was all legally done, then why on earth were there never any safety inspections done? And if it was illegal, why would an entire neighborhood not report him? It almost doesn't matter which is the case. If this went on for so long, then it's almost certain that there are others doing the same exact thing too. And Iraq is sitting on more caged creatures without the proper care that they deserve. Living, breathing, ticking time bombs, just waiting to exact upon their captors their deadly final affliction.
Nagano Prefecture in Japan is a scenic beauty, home to 9 of the 12 highest mountains in the country. The peaks and valleys offer spectacular alpine wilderness and national parks. Lake Kizaki, at the base of the Japanese Alps, attracts visitors to its shores to take advantage of the water sports on offer. And in the winter, skiers take to the mountains. The Japanese black bears, a subspecies of the Asian black bears, is found on Japan's 2 main islands and is thought to number around 10,000 in the whole of the country. But not all bears in Japan are wild, and not all are afforded the luxury of Japan's great mountains, ranges, and alpine meadows. 75-year-old Akira Maruyama lived with his wife down a long, narrow mountain road. His old, detached house was situated about an hour from Matsumoto City, where his daughter and her family lived. Akira didn't have many neighbors, but that suited him. He loved the outdoors and the quietness of his neighborhood. He hadn't long retired and was enjoying the slower pace of life that life in the countryside allowed for. In his younger days, he had been a hunter, but it never sat right with him, taking the life of another for the thrill of the hunt. So he laid down his gun and turned his hand to working at ironworks and civil engineering sites near Matsumoto. He was a kind-hearted man who loved animals. He could even touch wild deer if he sat still long enough behind the back of his house. He was patient and devoted to animals. He had since retired and grew rice and vegetables in his fields, living the good life and enjoying his freedom. He was still very much active in his neighborhood, regularly picking up trash and volunteering for local associations. But he shared his retired life with another individual, a bear. To those who didn't know the full story, the bear appeared to be confined to a small metal cage. The bars were rusted, the concrete slabs on the floor cracked, cold and dirty, and the tin roof flimsy. but those were just where the bear slept. Akira and his pet bear had formed a tight bond together. He considered the 20-year-old male Japanese black bear as part of the family and treated him as such. In fact, he had rescued him. The tiny bundle of fluff had been discovered on a road construction site 10 kilometers from where Akira lived. He had heard about the discovery through his civil engineering colleagues and visited the site to take a look for himself. Sure enough, the next day, the bear was still there. He must have only been a few weeks old. At about the size of a domestic house cat, the bear could barely move. The mother hadn't come back for it, and so it was either abandoned or had become separated and lost from his family. Akira knew the bear wouldn't survive much longer on its own, and so he took it in. He spent many painstaking hours trying to nurse it back to health. He fed it endless bottles of warm milk, and each time the bear would suckle, it would make a distinctive Pepe noise, and so Akira named him Pepe. When the cub regained his strength, Akira's grandchildren would come over and visit. They would wrestle with the small bear cub, rolling over and over on the grass. They could pick him up and cuddle him or chase each other around the garden. He quickly became part of the family, and Akira built the shed for him in the back garden. Although Pepe slept in there, he regularly wandered the garden and responded to the family's commands and calls. But he was growing up fast, and it wasn't long before he was mature. Akira knew he wouldn't survive in the wild, and so he applied for a license to keep it. He was granted permission, and soon people traveled from all over to see Akira and his pet bear. Children would knock on Akira's door and ask to see the bear. Their faces lit up when they saw the friendly, bumbling animal eating treats from Akira's hand or enjoying a back rub through the metal bars on his cage. Akira and Pepe's interactions were famous amongst locals. Akira fed him fruits, vegetables, and nuts, and Pepe gobbled them down gratefully. In the wild, the bears are mostly herbivorous, eating herbs and grasses in the spring before switching to berries and nuts later in the year to stock up before winter. They also consume meat and have been known to prey on wild antelope, deer, and boar. Japanese black bears are typically smaller than other species. The males grow to around 120 to 140 centimeters, 47 to 55 inches long, and weigh 60 to 120 kilograms, or 130 to 260 pounds. Despite being smaller in stature to other bears, Pepe was still incredibly strong. One day, he accidentally bit Akira's finger when he was feeding him, and Akira never made the same mistake again. From then on, he always wore leather gloves when feeding Pepe. 20 years passed with Pepe just as devoted to Akira as Akira was to him. But Akira, who had been a physically fit man all his life, was beginning to deteriorate. He had significant trouble with his lungs. He had retired from work, but was unable to fully enjoy his retirement due to his failing breathing. He carried an oxygen canister around with him wherever he went and was hooked up to it to help with his breathing. He could feel himself fading and told his family he didn't think he had long left. He wasn't the same man he used to be, but he continued to look after Pepe as he had always done. He was like a son to him. On the morning of November 28th, 2022, however, something happened to Akira that cannot be fully explained. His daughter came to collect his wife to take her for a hospital appointment when she found Akira slumped on the ground of Pepe's cage. She raced outside and knelt by his side. He had a faint pulse and his breathing was shallow. He was unresponsive. Pepe sat munching some gingo nuts from a bucket left outside the cage. The door was open and Pepe showed no signs of aggression, but Akira was covered in blood. It pooled down the concrete slab all around him. Cuts, scratches, and bite marks covered his body. His daughter immediately called emergency services, and Akira was raced to hospital. Sadly, he died a short while later. But what had happened? Had his trusted companion turned on him after 20 years together? Or was Pepe trying to play with Akira? As winter was approaching, Pepe may have been ravenous, stocking up on food to build fat reserves for the cold months ahead. He had devoured almost the entire bucket of nuts Akira had brought out for him. Maybe he had become overexcited when he smelt the food and had lunged at Akira. Even though he was only 1 meter long and weighed 80 kilograms, Pepe would have easily floored Akira, especially with his failing health. He was no match for the bear, and each and every bite was a devastating blow for the devoted owner. He could feel the power behind the strikes, the sharp sensation of Pepe's teeth biting into his flesh, and the slashes of the long claws. Perhaps Pepe had been over-playful with Akira and had jumped at him. He had been used to wrestling with the family over the years and could be boisterous, but as Akira lost his strength over the recent years, he was no longer able to play with Pepe as he once did. Later, a member from the local hunting club came and shot the bear. Akira's family was devastated on both counts. They had lost Akira, a devoted father, husband, and grandfather who was looking forward to retirement and spending time with his growing family. And they had lost Akira's longtime companion, the unique and playful Pepe, whom they had all known since he was a few weeks old. Akira's family didn't hold a grudge against Pepe. They knew he was very strong and that he may have playfully knocked Akira around. He didn't know his own strength, and they treated the death as an accident. They used a digger to dig a large hole for Pepe in the backyard. When news of the tragedy spread, neighbors came to pay their respects. They lit incense and lay flowers and apples on top of the upturned soil, a sign of respect for Pepe, a local celebrity who, just like Akira, met his terrifying final affliction.
To understand just how tragic and utterly unforgivable the events of October the 17th, 2024 was, we need to look at the two houses across from each other on a regular street in Circleville. In one lived Joe and Stanley Eichelbarger. This delightful retired couple moved to Circleville decades ago. The whole neighborhood knew them, loved them, and were devastated when Mr. Eichelbarger was diagnosed with Parkinson's and dementia. Even though they could afford to move to an upscale care facility, Joe insisted that her Stanley remain inside the familiar home for as long as they could. For 3 hours every morning, a caregiver arrived to help with bath and medication times. But other than that, Joe kept the house, and her ailing husband cared for all by herself. At 73, this absolute gem of a woman could still run circles around men and women half her age. Every other day, someone on the street stopped by to chat, to have tea, or to bring garden produce that they claimed they had no space for in the fridge. Anything to find an excuse to check that everything was all right without hurting Joe's pride. In short, the Eichelbargers were cherished by their neighbors. The Withers family was a whole other story. Susan Withers, age 62, and her son Adam, 35, lived across from Joe. The Withers avoided their neighbors and they never greeted anyone. The only time they were ever seen was when they went out to walk their two pit bulls, Echo and Apollo. Those canines were the reason that everyone feared that house. Children ran screaming from the dogs when they came down the sidewalk with them, and others crossed the road to get as far away from the creatures as a street would allow. And this was not because the neighbors were unfair toward the breed at all. Apollo and Echo had proven time and time again that they were vicious and bloodthirsty. On the rare occasions that they were out, they'd strain and pull at their leashes, the drool flying from their mouths as they barked, growled, and desperately fought to get loose to attack anyone and anything that moved. Once, Apollo saw a man walking his dog through the living room window and slammed his body against it so hard to get at the dog that the window shattered to pieces. Luckily, Adam was able to restrain the dog before it got out of the house by dragging Apollo back inside by his hind legs, since Apollo was already halfway out the window. Another time, Susan was out walking Echo. They passed a woman and her 12-week-old beagle puppy, and Echo ripped loose from his owner, throwing herself onto the poor puppy. The puppy died, and Susan barely got a hold of Echo in time before she attacked the hysterical woman, too. Police were called about the incident. Unfortunately, there were no serious repercussions for this event. The day all of the warning signs finally came to a head was on October 17th. Joe had just bade goodbye to the caregiver, and Stanley had dozed off in his favorite chair. So Joe took the opportunity to tend to her garden. Across the street, Adam Withers had opened the front door, leaving the much flimsier screen door latched. The moment Joe set her tools and compost bags down in the rose bed, the dogs were at the newly installed sitting room window, barking so hysterically that the window was soon splattered with spit. Joe ignored them. This wasn't new at all. The manic snarls and barks greeted her every time she set foot out of her front door. But at least they were trapped behind a reinforced window, so it was best that she continued about her business while they tired themselves out. Only 4 minutes into her work, her back turned to the frenzied yowls. The pair discovered the open front door. They'd worked themselves into such a crazed state at the woman across the street that they charged at the door, blasting it off its hinges, sending splinters flying everywhere. When the door hit the porch, they were already halfway across the street, streaking toward Joe like murderous lightning bolts. Joe heard the door explode, whipped her head around, and saw the canines, teeth bared, sprinting straight at her. Joe managed a terrified scream and held her hands in front of her face, her trowel still in her hand, before they were on top of her. Apollo slammed into her so hard that Joe's frail body went flying several feet backward. His teeth were already impaled into her hand, holding the trowel. He shook her once, ripping her arm away from her face, and then Echo struck, sinking her teeth into the side of Joe's head. Joe screamed as loud as her lungs could muster when her ear and part of her scalp was ripped off, alerting several people nearby. When the first man arrived, Adam had finally realized what was happening and was running out of his house, still dressed in his boxers, his mother close behind him. But whatever the people streaming toward Joe were expecting, it was nothing compared to the terrible scene they came upon. The dogs were whipping and thrashing their heads, one now latched on Joe's shoulder and the other on her leg, pulling her from both ends. And Joe was fighting as best she could, hitting Echo with her hand, the bent-up trowel still between shattered fingers. Adam and Susan Withers stood there with their mouths hanging agape, completely dumbfounded. But 3 men and 1 brave woman rushed toward the bundle of flailing limbs, while a 5th woman called the police. Echo was grabbed up first, put in a headlock by an ex-policeman. She let go, but the man lost control of her almost immediately, barely keeping her at bay by storming at her with his arms held wide every time she tried to charge back into the fray. 2 men pulled Apollo off Joe, but it only resulted in the dog's teeth tearing an entire chunk out of her shoulder. Blood went spurting out of her, and the animal would have thrown himself right back if the 3 people hadn't started kicking him. When the first patrol car arrived, Joe was lying on the lawn, a flap of her scalp over what was left of her face. Her left shoulder, leg, chest, and neck were completely ruined, and she was covered in so much blood that her gray hair and blue dress was completely red. All 5 civilians were still in a deadly standoff with the dogs. Every time the pair tried to attack, they were met with kicks, a shovel, and a hosepipe that they'd managed to arm themselves with, while the Withers screamed uselessly from the street for his dogs to back down. The officers called the people back and opened fire. Both dogs were shot once, each taking the hit in their sides. If you think that would be enough to down them, then you'd be dead wrong. Apollo got up and charged like a maniac straight towards the guns. He was hit twice more, right in the chest, as he launched himself at the officer. Echo, meanwhile, took the distraction and ran off, with a bullet wound in her body. 15 minutes later, she came upon a woman and her dog, 4 blocks away, and ripped the Labrador's throat out. They were just yards away from a middle school. Luckily, the woman managed to run for her life while the beast was occupied with tearing her lab to shreds. Echo, dragging the Labrador that was now dead, tried to limp home. She reached the street where police cars were now lined up and walked right into several armed policemen waiting for her. It took only 1 more round for Echo to fall dead. The remains of the limp Labrador still clutched in her blood-stained muzzle, and by that time Joe had already breathed her last. The ambulance arrived, loaded her onto a stretcher, and then her heart just gave out. That amount of adrenaline, the incomprehensible pain and massive loss of blood, Joe's heart just couldn't take it anymore. The only good things to come out of this horrendous affair was that when Stanley woke up, he was no longer lucid. He didn't realize that his wife was killed in the most brutal way possible, and he hasn't had a clear day since Joe wasn't there to bring back his memories with her familiar face anymore. Adam and Susan Withers were sentenced to 14 years behind bars apiece. All in all, their deplorable negligence and complete disregard for others' safety has led to the deaths of 3 dogs and 1 dear, sweet old woman who only ever wanted her rose bushes to bloom for her husband one more time. This is what happens when untrained, neglected dogs descend upon innocent people. And it's always the most innocent, those who should be protected, that suffer at the jaws of nature's final affliction.